This presentation is based on Khaled Hosseini's novel, A Thousand Splendid Suns. The abuse of power is a central theme in this literary work. The most basic definition of power refers to the ability to do or act or accomplish something. This definition applies to the individual level. At a communal level, power is tied to the concept of leadership, and it manifests as the ability to direct or influence the behavior of others or the course of events. Higher levels of power that apply to organizations involve authoritative, political, legal, and military power. The abuse of power, taken out of the legal context, is related to the notion of corruptibility. Most people are familiar with the expression power corrupts, or with the longer version made popular by Lord Acton, absolute power corrupts absolutely. Power is intrinsic to human relationships at every level. When people do not use their power well, they abuse their power. Abuses of power always bring harm and can take many forms, such as taking advantage of people, manipulating emotionally and psychologically, and punishing people if they don't comply, inflicting physical pain, taking away freedoms and rights. When people abuse power, they become corrupt. Absolute corruption happens when people become intoxicated with power and use it to bring harm just because they can, without an apparent ultimate motive or gain. A very good illustration of the corruptible influence of power is the notorious Stanford prison experiment conducted in 1971, which was halted after a group of students who were randomly assigned to serve as prison guards over another group began to abuse their wards. The legitimate way to obtain power is through good leadership, but even legitimate power is corruptible. Absolute power is grasped and maintained by preying on the weak, coercion, deception, force, and disregard for people. More often, women and children find themselves at the receiving end of corrupted powers. In the Western world, people live in societies where there are institutional checks and balances to balance power. Some of these checks and balances are the justice system, education, electoral system for legislative appointments, and a healthy and cohesive civil society. These checks and balances develop over time during periods of peace and stability. Some areas of the world are plagued by a succession of tumultuous conflicts which are expressions of internal power struggles. Afghanistan, for example, has experienced a monarchy, a constitutional monarchy, a socialist republic, an Islamic government, and Islamic emirate, and an Islamic republic, and then back to an Islamic emirate over the span of only 100 years, from 1922 to 2001. In a 2020 report, Transparency International classified Afghanistan in the top 15 most corrupt countries in the world. Every 30 minutes, an Afghan woman dies during childbirth. 80% of Afghan women are illiterate. 1 in every 3 Afghan girls are married before their 18th birthday. 44 years is now the average life expectancy for women across the country. 70 to 80% of women faced forced marriages in Afghanistan. These stats are provided by UNICEF. Hey there. Although statistics can be eye-opening, one of the best ways to understand the plight of a population living under the influence of corrupt absolute power is through literary works. In his novel, A Thousand Splendid Suns, Khaled Hosseini explores the theme of oppression and hope by chronicling the political and personal power shifts and corruption that affect the society and the people of Afghanistan over generations, through the lives of 2 female characters, Maryam and Laila. Politics is the prerogative of the men. Afghani women hear about political changes from them. Usually this news comes with interpretations. The women are not expected to have a frame of reference to understand. They have to submit to the consequences of the change. Jalil was Miriam's link, her proof that there existed a world at large. He was the one who told her, in the summer of 1973, that King Zahir Shah, who had ruled from Kabul for 40 years, had been overthrown in a bloodless coup. Page 23. Jalil went on to explain that the country was a republic now, and that there were rumors that the socialists were responsible for the coup. When Miriam asked, "What is a socialist?" Jalil found it too tedious to explain to a girl. Later on in her marriage to Rashid, Miriam narrowly escaped a beating when she showed too much interest in the understanding of the political changes. Lila's ability to stand up to her husband and his political views showed the wind of change that came over the country with the falling of the Taliban regime. Every new change is welcomed with hope by the people of Afghanistan, especially the women. This is evidence for people's convictions that power can be wielded without harm. When communists took power, there was more hope for women participation in society. Women had always had it hard in this country, but they're probably more free now under the communists and had more rights than they've ever had before. Page 135. But the Soviets turned out to rule with an iron fist and propaganda. Lila's father himself lost his job as a teacher and worked in a factory for the rest of his life. The Mujahideen were fighters armed by the Americans to resist the Soviet regime through violent acts. People had high hopes of freedom, including Lila's brothers who joined their ranks. After they took power, they recklessly attacked the population under a regime of inconceivable terror and destruction. Many people were killed, including Lila's parents. Mourning brought no relief. The muezzin call for namaz rang out, and the Mujahideen set down their guns, faced west, and prayed. Then the rugs were folded, the guns loaded, and the mountains fired on Kabul. And Kabul fired back at the mountains. And Lila and the rest of the city watched as helpless old Santiago watching the sharks take bites out of his prize fish. Page 174. The Taliban's fame preceded them. They gained power on the promise to make peace and order after years of chaos and suffering under the Mujahideen. But their ultimate goal was to establish an Islamic state and bring in Sharia law. The women of Afghanistan experienced a level of violence and oppression as never seen before. Barred from living in the home, from showing their faces, they became prisoners without relief. The whole society suffered under the Taliban purge. Cultural annihilation and public executions followed. Corrupt, greedy Mujahideen commanders armed to the teeth, rich on heroin, declaring jihad on one another and killing everyone in between. At least the Taliban are pure and incorruptible. Page 274. But in reality, things turned out for the worst. The terror and oppression intensified. They used fear to increase their power. Lila heard of men being dragged from the streets, accused of skipping namaz, and shoved into mosques. She learned that Marco Polo restaurant near Chicken Street had been turned into an interrogation center. Sometimes screaming was heard from behind black-painted windows. Page 281. Women are deprived of basic human rights, such as access to health care, education, and a fair justice system. Miriam did not go to school. Her trial was only 15 minutes long with no witnesses, no appeal, and a speedy public execution. Lila gave birth in squalor, under surgery, without anesthetic. Cultural influence gives Afghani men an inordinate amount of power. Not all men are abusing their power. There are many examples in the narrative of men not corrupted by their position of power, such as Bobby, Lila's father, or Tariq, and his father. But the society at large encourages, and through political power, enforces imbalances of power. Bobby meant the areas where women were rarely seen on the streets, and only then in burqas and accompanied by men. He meant those regions where men who lived by ancient tribal laws rebelled against the communists and their decrees to liberate women, to abolish forced marriage, to raise the minimum marriage age to 16 for girls. There, men saw it as an insult to their centuries-old traditions. Bobby said, to be told by the government that their daughters had to leave home, attend school, and work alongside men, Lila, my love, the only enemy an Afghan cannot defeat is himself. Page 136. Men used their power over women to take advantage of them. Miriam's father took advantage of Nana, who was his housekeeper, to forcefully marry underage girls. Miriam and Lila married Rashid under pressure, to confine them under burqas or at home, to abuse them emotionally and physically without fear of punishment. His powerful hands clasped her jaw. He shoved 2 fingers into her mouth and pried it open, and then forced the cold, hard pebbles into it. Shoo, he bellowed. Page 104. Without saying a word, he swung the belt at Lila. He did it with such speed that she had no time to react or even raise a protective arm. Page 345. Women attach their personal hopes to men. An example is Miriam and her father Jalil. Miriam hoped she would find a place in the world as a legitimate child with the help of her father, but he abandoned her again. She continued to put her hope in her marriage with Rashid, but that too became a disappointment, as their relationship was abusive. Lila hoped Rashid will save her and her unborn child, but he almost killed her. The personal stories of hope are mirrored by the political hopes of the Afghan people. Similar to the personal hope of individuals, Afghans' hope often turns to despair after the realities of each new regime leave the nation under the influence of corrupted power. Nearly all men can stand adversity, but if you want to test a man's character, give him power. Are people like Rashid already corrupt, or does having power over others corrupt him? What type of power has more influence in society, cultural or political? What evidence of corrupted power can you see in our society? Works cited.